The spring of 1241 found Vienna gripped by profound terror, a fear far exceeding the usual apprehension caused by neighboring kingdoms' aggression. This dread stemmed from something ancient and deeply unsettling, compelling monarchs to lose their appetites, clerics to cease preaching, and common folk to gather their belongings and flee. The Mongols were approaching, having already ravaged through Poland. In April, they had decimated the joint forces of Poland and the Holy Roman Empire at the Battle of Legnica. Concurrently, another Mongol detachment crushed the Hungarian army at the Battle of Mohi, located 300 miles to the south. These were two meticulously coordinated operations, executed simultaneously against distinct adversaries, separated by 300 miles. King Bela IV of Hungary fled on horseback, relentlessly pursued by Mongol cavalry until he reached the Adriatic coast. Mongol scouts were subsequently spotted along the Adriatic shoreline. Across the European continent, only scattered, demoralized armies, whose finest soldiers had already been annihilated, stood between these riders and the Atlantic Ocean. Desperate letters flowed from King Louis IX of France. Pope Gregory IX issued a call for a crusade, not against Muslims this time, but against this Eastern force that defied all European notions of God, treaties, and logic. Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II frantically mobilized a defense. Panic was universal. No one had a viable strategy. Then, in the late spring of 1241, the Mongols halted their advance and retreated from the Adriatic, withdrawing from Hungary and vanishing eastward with astonishing speed. Europe was spared. For decades afterward, the reason for this sudden withdrawal remained a mystery. The enigma of why humanity's most formidable war machine abruptly paused at the threshold of a world it was poised to conquer stands as one of medieval history's greatest puzzles. This is but one of the questions we will explore today. As the narrative of the Mongol Empire extends beyond mere conquest, it chronicles the impact of a single individual, a fervent, brilliant, impoverished outcast from the Mongolian steppe, who set out to reshape the entire globe. It also details the disintegration of that world, that empire, that vision from within. This is the complete saga, its ascent, zenith, decline, and collapse. Let's delve in. You're already familiar with Genghis Khan's rise to power, with Temujin, with 1206, and the Kurultai on the Onan River. Therefore, we won't revisit his origin story today. My focus is the formidable organization he constructed. Genghis Khan was not simply a conqueror. He engineered a warfare system unprecedented in history, whose unique blend of elements has never been entirely replicated. Consider the military's framework. The Mongol army adhered to a precise decimal system, organizing units into groups of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 men. The 10,000-man formation, known as a tumen, was efficient, scalable, and readily comprehensible to commanders at every rank. Its truly revolutionary aspect, however, was that these were not solely military units. They also served as administrative and tax divisions. The decimal structure permeated every facet of Mongol societal organization. Every man understood his exact position within the hierarchy, ensuring clarity, preventing redundancies, and eliminating instances of units appearing on the wrong battlefield due to garbled orders from intermediaries. Commanders were selected purely on merit, disregarding lineage or tribal seniority. Exceptional military prowess led to advancement. Genghis elevated individuals like Subutai and Jebe, both of humble origins, to supreme military command, bypassing men from more esteemed backgrounds. Subutai, in particular, arguably became the greatest purely tactical military mind of the entire medieval period, anywhere in the world. He never lost a major engagement over a career that spanned decades and dozens of campaigns across half of Eurasia. The Mongol system identified and promoted him because it was intrinsically designed to uncover talent irrespective of its source. Now, regarding psychological warfare, I wish to be precise here, as it is often loosely described in ways that obscure its deliberate and systematic nature. Every city and kingdom in the path of a Mongol advance received a formal ultimatum. The conditions were consistently the same: surrender, submit, pay tribute, and your populace would be left undisturbed. Your customs would be respected, your merchants safeguarded on the roads, and your local leaders could retain their positions, provided they cooperated. This was not an empty pledge. The Mongols generally honored these commitments. Subjugated cities that submitted peacefully were often governed with a light hand. Taxed, yes, but not ravaged. However, to resist, even briefly, even unsuccessfully, meant that once defenses fell, the reprisal was absolute, systematically so. Following a prolonged siege, the Mongol forces mandated that their soldiers execute a specific quota of the resident population. Every individual, from common soldier to high-ranking officer, participated in this act. This wasn't indiscriminate violence. It was a deliberate tactic designed to fulfill a grander strategic objective. When neighboring settlements learned of the fate of cities that resisted, they often surrendered without contest, even before the Mongol vanguard had established their camp. This atmosphere of dread accomplished much of their objective, frequently more than half. Prior to initiating any significant military campaign, Mongol scouts and clandestine operatives spent prolonged periods embedded within enemy territories. Their mission extended beyond merely counting enemy troops or sketching defensive structures. They meticulously charted societal divisions, identifying rival noble families, disgruntled governors alienated from their central authority, and religious minorities suffering oppression who might welcome a new regime. They pinpointed urban centers experiencing food shortages and restless inhabitants unlikely to passionately defend rulers who had neglected them. Consequently, by the time the Mongol army crossed the border, their generals often possessed a deeper understanding of the adversary's internal political landscape than many of the enemy's own officials. Rather than battering down fortifications, they exploited existing vulnerabilities. This explains why the vast, affluent, and ostensibly militarily formidable Khwarezmian Empire collapsed within approximately 2 years. Despite Shah Muhammad II commanding a larger army than Genghis Khan, the Mongol intelligence network pinpointed a crucial structural flaw. Muhammad's severely strained relationship with his mother, Turkin Khatun, who independently controlled the eastern noble families. When the Mongols arrived, the empire could not present a united front. Different regions made autonomous decisions. Some immediately capitulated, while others fought without the benefit of reinforcements. The entire structure unraveled. The Mongols had identified this weakness even before the first arrow was loosed. Furthermore, Mongol logistics, often overlooked, played a crucial role. Each warrior traveled with a remuda of 3 to 5 horses, a string of mounts rotated throughout the day's march. This allowed for continuous travel, as a warrior would simply switch to a fresh horse when his current one tired. This system dramatically increased the effective march speed of a Mongol army, making it 2 to 3 times faster than comparable European or Chinese forces. Enemies planning defenses based on a 2-week projection of Mongol arrival were frequently caught off guard when the Mongols appeared in 5 days. Their logistical demands were also remarkably low compared to other medieval armies. Mongol soldiers carried dehydrated meat, dried milk curds, and minimal gear. In dire circumstances, they resorted to bleeding their horses for sustenance during extended marches, a seemingly desperate measure that was an integral part of their logistical planning. They required virtually no traditional supply train because the warriors themselves served as the supply apparatus. Moreover, when confronting walled cities, a challenge not inherent to open steppe cavalry traditions, they adeptly adapted. They conscripted engineers from every civilization they subjugated: Chinese experts in siege engines, Persian specialists in undermining fortifications, and captive Central Asian artisans skilled in counterweight trebuchets and naphtha fire weapons were all incorporated. The Mongols didn't merely acquire technology. They assimilated entire technical workforces and integrated these newly acquired capabilities into their military's operational framework. Finally, the yam, the Mongol relay postal system stands as one of the most underrated innovations of pre-modern history. Relay stations were strategically placed every 20 to 40 li across their vast empire, each stocked with fresh horses. A rider bearing urgent imperial dispatches could cover an astonishing 200 miles in a single day. This infrastructure enabled intelligence, commands, and diplomatic correspondence to traverse thousands of miles within days. In an era where most armies communicated at the pace of a walking horse, the Mongols operated with a speed akin to a telegraph. The convergence of these elements, including decimal organization, merit-based command, their calculated terror strategy, an extensive intelligence network, superior mobility, adaptable siege tactics, and a sophisticated communication system, created more than just a formidable army. It forged a systemic, power-projecting, and sustaining machine capable of scalable operation, adaptation, continuous learning, and coherent functioning across distances no other military force had previously mastered. To counter such a system, an equally sophisticated system is required, and none had been developed. If one were to pinpoint a singular moment that encapsulates the Mongol Empire's capabilities and distinguishes their conquests from ordinary ones, it would be February 1258 in Baghdad. To truly grasp the significance of Baghdad's fall, one must recognize its true nature, far more than just a city. For 5 centuries, Baghdad had been the intellectual nucleus of the Islamic world, and among the most vital hubs of human knowledge globally. The Abbasid Caliphate had established something genuinely extraordinary there. Established in the late 8th century by Caliph Harun al-Rashid and substantially broadened by his son al-Mamun, the House of Wisdom, or Beit al-Hikmah, represented an ambitious state-funded initiative. Its goal was a systematic effort to gather, translate, and integrate the collective knowledge of all civilizations accessible to the Islamic world. Greek philosophical texts, encompassing works by Aristotle, Plato, Euclid, and Galen, found their way into Arabic. Persian astronomical traditions were incorporated, and Indian mathematical breakthroughs, which eventually became known as Arabic numerals despite their Indian origins, were adopted and disseminated westward. Al-Khwarizmi, whose treatise on algebra not only gave us the term algebra, but whose name also led to algorithm, was a prominent figure here. Ibn al-Haytham, whose 11th century work on optics laid the groundwork for the scientific method, built upon 2 centuries of intellectual legacy fostered in Baghdad. This wasn't merely a conventional library filled with shelves. It was a dynamic research hub where scholars from various disciplines and linguistic backgrounds collaborated. Fields like mathematics, astronomy, and Pfaffing specified. Fields like Felding Feitelfeld in Truth Examples in Leibred. Fields like Mafir, like Program Board of Numerals, provide some convinces. Fields like Mafir, like Fielding Feitelfeld and Leichtedwerk to the Basevos. Fields like Verbrer in the military bad game had in simple important features to bring the room from a small ball. Fields like Mafir, like Fielding supports of intramatically. Fields like Pointy military, like Musli, in to play their employet. Fields like 2 millions of Brer and the Bestfield had in simplement more. Fields like Fievel, like Program Visitals impedance. Fields like the business in Programly pick and everybody has been and continue. Fields like Musli and business in play the room from a small ball. Fields like 2 millions of Brer and the Defton become supports of or epident. Fields like 60 years olds and forded in greatments. Fields like Ranger limes and fold part of it from Helthing. Fields like Mr. Journalism and Junercly generated when everybody has been and convince of them. Fields like research their lives and development things like wide, in the distance of rest become supportsome. Fields like 60 years olds made themselves in a break and flicks to get similar made from factors. Fields like people, which is good ability in Breveld and Cryment. Fields like speakers and just well over some of May closers in moral times. Fields like presidency, like flims in the Indivits, lifted known and middle and bagward for generated. Fields like mistrogynalism in program with a mother place. Fields like one field being more, and trippertly selfdom. Fields like bless place to come and charges company for repetent. Fields like one word's performance and the ageively provide something. Fields like mistrogenalism and mother place to come in truth of the room. Fields like one millions of not presidency and brings in the day in comfort it. Fields like mistrogenalism in program within stage. Fields like mistrogenalism and one more previously and done, but upon 2 centuries of intellectual legacy adopted upon 2 centuries of mathematics, astronomy, and advanced medicine continuously informed philosophy, ensuring a constant and fruitful exchange of ideas. By the year 1200, most reputable historians considered Baghdad the world's foremost intellectually vibrant city. The caliph in 1258 was al-Mustasam, and it is at this juncture that the tale takes an almost operatically tragic turn. Al-Mustasam made a series of critically flawed decisions, to put it as gently as possible. Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis and commander of the Mongol forces in the west, issued his customary ultimatum: submit, acknowledge Mongol suzerainty, pay tribute, and survive. This was the same proposition that numerous rulers had accepted and found viable in practice, not a deceptive ploy. The Mongols were quite prepared for the caliphate to persist as a subordinate, tribute-paying entity. However, al-Mustasam refused, sending back an insolent reply and vaguely promising to rally the entire Muslim world to his defense. These promised armies never materialized. His own military was crippled by internal factionalism, with his top general and chief minister caught in a power struggle that rendered any coordinated defense virtually impossible. When Hulagu's forces, estimated between 100,000 and 150,000 men, and supported by Chinese engineers with siege weaponry, arrived, the caliph had perhaps 50,000 defenders who were already disorganized, demoralized, and outmaneuvered before any fighting commenced. The siege, which began in late January 1258, lasted under 2 weeks. The city's walls were breached on February 10th. What ensued was 13 days of unprecedented slaughter, difficult to comprehend even with historical perspective. Accounts from the era speak of streets awash with blood, skies choked with smoke, and piles of corpses forming new geographical features. While medieval chroniclers often exaggerated, a well-known characteristic of historical writing from that period. Even after significantly accounting for such rhetorical embellishment, the death toll was staggering. Modern historians estimate that between 90,000 and 200,000 people were killed within the city itself. Higher medieval estimates of 800,000 are generally thought implausible, though not entirely impossible given Baghdad's dense population. The libraries were destroyed, scholars were either killed or fled, and the intricate network of canals and irrigation systems that had sustained agriculture across the Tigris-Euphrates basin for centuries was ruined, much of it permanently. One recurring detail in multiple historical accounts, consistent enough to be considered plausibly accurate by historians, is particularly haunting. So many books were cast into the Tigris River that its waters turned black with ink before becoming red with blood. 5 centuries of accumulated intellectual synthesis vanished in mere days. Al-Mustasam, the caliph himself, was executed. Adhering to the tradition that royal blood should not touch the ground, the Mongols rolled Al-Mustasam in a carpet, some sources say felt, others a rug, and had him beaten or trampled to death by horses. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had endured for over 500 years, ceased to exist in a single afternoon. There was no successor, no continuation, no orderly transition. It simply ended. Now, I wish to expand beyond the conventional narrative, as the simplistic "Mongols burned the library" version overlooks a crucial complexity. Hulagu Khan was not merely a destructive force. His principal wife, Doku's Khatun, was a Nestorian Christian who wielded considerable personal influence. Hulagu's own mother had also been a Nestorian Christian. At the time of the Baghdad campaign, the Mongol court exhibited a blend of religious beliefs, with Christians, Buddhists, shamanists, and Muslims all exercising influence within the prevailing power structure. Hulagu's perspective on religion was quintessentially Mongol, deeply practical. He was primarily concerned with the political utility of religious leaders, not theological rectitude. The pronounced Christian presence within his inner circle significantly influenced the aftermath of the conquest in ways that are seldom acknowledged. Baghdad's churches were largely spared, and the Nestorian patriarch Machika II was granted a palace seized from a Muslim official. Christian communities, who had experienced varying degrees of restriction under the Abbasid Caliphate, suddenly found themselves under more forbearing rulers. This explains why contemporary Armenian and Syriac Christian chronicles depict the fall of Baghdad with considerably less dread than Muslim accounts. They were experiencing a genuinely distinct event, one that removed those whom they considered oppressors. History rarely presents wholly evil figures, even in its most brutal episodes. The decimation of the House of Wisdom represents one of humanity's true intellectual catastrophes. Yet it was orchestrated by a man who, just 2 years later, engaged in correspondence with European Crusader kings regarding a potential Christian-Mongol alliance against the Mamluks. The destroyer of that magnificent library was also a sophisticated diplomat with a diverse household and a Nestorian Christian wife who reportedly intervened to spare lives during the pillaging. The world is intricate, and Baghdad in 1258 stands as a poignant testament to this complexity. One enduring structural consequence of the Baghdad campaign warrants specific attention due to its long-term ramifications. The agricultural heartland of Mesopotamia, the Tigris-Euphrates floodplain, which had sustained dense human settlements since ancient times and served as the cradle of urban civilization itself, was ravaged in a manner that proved largely irreversible. The intricate canal networks, crucial for functionality, demanded continuous upkeep and coordinated administrative oversight. Following 1258, this oversight vanished. The canals became clogged with silt, and agricultural productivity declined. The population vital to the system's maintenance dwindled. What had once been among the most agriculturally fruitful lands on Earth began a protracted decline towards the semi-arid state characteristic of much of modern Iraq. This transformative process, initiated in 1258, has never been fully reversed. The Mongols destroyed a city and inadvertently contributed to the devastation of an ecosystem. 2 years subsequent to Baghdad, the Mongols continued their westward advance. Hulagu's forces captured Aleppo in January 1260 and Damascus in March. The Crusader states, the vestiges of the Latin kingdoms established by European crusades a century and a half earlier, observed these events from their remaining coastal strongholds. After thorough diplomatic deliberation, they opted for a form of armed neutrality. Some Crusader lords clandestinely hoped the Mongols would press further south and dismantle the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, which represented the primary military threat to the surviving Crusader territories. The enemy of my enemy strategy. However, Hulagu then received news that fundamentally altered the situation. His brother, Möngke Khan, the Great Khan, the supreme ruler of the entire empire, had died in August 1259 during the campaign against the Song dynasty in southern China. He likely succumbed to dysentery, though the precise circumstances remain unclear. According to Mongol succession law, all significant princes of the blood were required to return for the Kurultai, the grand assembly that would select the next great Khan. Hulagu departed, taking the majority of his army east. He left a holding force in the Levant, commanded by his general Kitbuka Noyan, estimated to be between 10,000 and 20,000 men. This force was intended for territorial control, not for continued large-scale offensive operations. In Cairo, the Mamluk Sultan Qutuz instantly grasped the profound implications of this development. The moment had arrived, and it was a singular opportunity. Should the Mongols consolidate their succession, regroup, and returned to the Levant with their full might, Egypt would fall. And with Egypt, the last major independent Islamic power in the region would be extinguished. Everything that remained of the civilization Baghdad symbolized, the fleeing scholars, the enduring traditions, would disappear. Qutuz acted decisively. He formed an alliance with Bibers, a general of exceptional caliber, a man who would later depose Qutuz and ascend to the Sultanate himself, his ambition perfectly complementing his military genius. Qutuz marched north with his complete army. On September 3, 1260, at a place called Ain Jalut, the Spring of Goliath, located in the Jezreel Valley in what is now northern Israel, the Mamluks and the Mongol holding force clashed in an open-field battle. The Mamluks emerged victorious. It is crucial to note that the Mongol forces at Ain Jalut did not represent the full extent of Mongol military power. Böke possessed capability, yet he wasn't comparable to military strategists like Subutai or Jebi. The military unit was under strength, operating far from its supply lines, lacking the reserve power typically supporting Mongol operations. Furthermore, this was not Genghis Khan's prime army engaging an equally formidable adversary. Instead, it was a weakened garrison force confronting a determined, expertly led, numerically superior foe battling on familiar ground. The Mamluks themselves were hardly ordinary opponents. They constituted a military elite, Turkish and Circassian males acquired as slaves specifically for military instruction from early childhood. The Mamluk system deliberately detached these warriors from family connections, tribal loyalty, and local ties, cultivating soldiers whose entire identity revolved around military excellence and fidelity to the Sultanate. They were arguably the most professionally trained soldiers globally at that historical juncture. Bibars, leading the Mamluk vanguard, employed a feigned retreat to ensnare Böke's contingent into a prearranged ambush. This was a classic Mongol stratagem, and the Mamluks' ability to execute it against the Mongols speaks volumes about their thorough understanding of their adversaries. Böke pursued the Mamluk flanking units closely. Böke was captured and subsequently executed. The Mongol force was largely annihilated. The Mongols made several further attempts to reclaim the Levant. A significant invasion between 1299 and 1300 under Ilkhanate actually succeeded in temporarily recapturing Damascus, but the Mamluks repelled them once more. They tried again in 1303, after which the attempts ceased. The border largely stabilized where it stood after Ain Jalut. The Mamluks maintained control of Egypt and the Levant until the Ottoman conquest in 1516. The Mongols never managed to breach their defenses. The military importance of Ain Jalut is undeniable, but it should not be overstated. It was not, in itself, a catastrophic defeat for the Mongol Empire in terms of sheer casualties. Its historical significance, however, lies in shattering a psychological barrier. For half a century, the Mongol advance had exuded an aura of inevitability. One might delay them or render the conquest costly, but the notion that one could actually halt them, vanquish them in open combat, and drive them back, that concept had not existed as a practical possibility in the minds of rulers and armies across Eurasia. Genghis's army had never suffered a major setback. Ögedei's generals had never been defeated. The war machine had never faltered. Ain Jalut publicly and visibly broke that assumption, in a manner that every court and military establishment from Morocco to China could acknowledge, proclaiming, "It is possible." This holds more weight than the specific tactical details of a single battle. Once an aura of invincibility is shattered, it cannot be restored. Future adversaries of the Mongols engaged with different expectations. They knew, as an established historical fact, that Mongol armies could be defeated on the battlefield. That realization altered how people strategized, how fiercely they resisted, and how long they endured. There's also a structural point worth considering. The Mongol military system was designed for and proven effective in the open steppe and on the relatively flat landscapes of northern China and central Persia. Its overwhelming advantages, cavalry mobility, rapid encirclement, and psychological warfare were maximized in expansive terrain with ample room for maneuver. The topography of the Levant, the mountain passes of Vietnam and Japan, and the narrow defiles of Poland's forests compressed the battlefield in ways that nullified cavalry mobility and eliminated the space for the feigned retreat and encirclement tactics that formed the core of Mongol tactical doctrine. The further the empire stretched from its Central Asian heartland, the more the terrain worked against the system rather than for it. This wasn't immediately apparent. The machine was powerful enough to overcome geographical disadvantages for a considerable period. However, Ain Jalut marked the first instance where the cumulative effect of strategic overextension and unfavorable terrain resulted in an outright defeat. It would not be the last. Before we delve into the empire's internal collapse, let's examine one more external failure, as it illuminates an important aspect of Mongol power often overshadowed by the more dramatically cinematic parts of the narrative. Kublai Khan, governing from his capital at Dadu, the city that would later become Beijing, commanded more territory than any single ruler in recorded human history. His declared ambition was universal dominion. He had incorporated northern China and completed the conquest of the southern Song dynasty by 1279. He received tribute from Korea, Tibet, and the kingdoms of mainland Southeast Asia. His sights were set on Japan, which had rebuffed him on multiple occasions. Kublai's emissaries arrived, demanding submission and tribute. The Kamakura shogunate, which truly governed Japan while the emperor was a mere figurehead, outright ignored two of these diplomatic overtures. They then executed the representatives of a third delegation. Such actions, by Mongol standards, were extreme provocations usually leading to the annihilation of a civilization. The initial assault in November 1274 involved a contingent of approximately 40,000 Mongol, Chinese, and Korean soldiers who navigated the Korea Strait and landed on Kyushu's northwestern coast. The experience on the beach was profoundly unsettling for the Japanese defenders. The samurai, accustomed to a specific combat tradition involving individual duels and formalized warfare, the ritualized aggression inherent in Japanese military culture, were confronted by something entirely alien. They faced massed coordinated infantry formations, disciplined volley archery, and explosive projectiles, tactics completely new to them. The Mongol military system was so unlike Japanese conventions that the defenders suffered significant losses in the first skirmishes. However, rather than pressing inland, the Mongol commanders opted to retreat to their vessels for the night. That night, a storm began. While not utterly destructive, the damage was considerable, though not decisive. Nevertheless, it was severe enough to compel the invasion fleet to withdraw to Korea and regroup. The initial attempt had concluded. Kublai immediately began to strategize a second, more substantial invasion, a preparation that consumed 7 years. The 1281 expedition was colossal. A northern fleet of about 40,000 troops sailed from Korea, and a southern fleet of approximately 100,000 soldiers, largely conscripted from the recently subdued Song dynasty territories, departed from southern China. The total invasion force numbered around 140,000 soldiers, aboard an estimated 4,400 ships. If these figures are even generally accurate, this constituted the largest amphibious military operation known in history up to that point, potentially unprecedented until the Allied landings in Normandy in 1944. From its inception, the operation was plagued by organizational chaos. The two fleets were meant to synchronize their movements and arrival, but they did not. The Southern Fleet, having a greater distance to cover, arrived weeks after the Northern Fleet had already been engaged in battle and sustained casualties along the Kyushu coast. Once finally assembled, the combined force struggled to establish a firm beachhead. The Japanese, who had spent the 7 years since the first invasion constructing defensive fortifications at probable landing sites, fought with notable efficacy. Neither belligerent managed to gain a decisive upper hand. Then, in late August 1281, during the peak of typhoon season, a massive storm descended upon the anchored fleet. The devastation was absolute. Chinese and Korean shipbuilders rushed to meet Kublai's demand for a colossal armada, had often built vessels using rivercraft designs ill-suited for the open ocean. Some of these ships may have literally been flat-bottomed river barges. In a powerful typhoon, they stood no chance. The storm raged for 2 days. When it finally subsided, an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the entire fleet was gone. Of the soldiers who had been aboard those lost ships, most survivors were captured and systematically executed by the Japanese in the ensuing days. The Japanese named these tempests kamikaze, meaning divine winds. The belief that the gods themselves had intervened to safeguard Japan became a foundational cornerstone of Japanese national identity. 6 centuries later, Japanese pilots undertaking suicidal missions in the Second World War would be named after these very storms. The legend persisted long after the empire that fostered it faded. However, I propose an alternative interpretation of these events. The Mongol invasion of Japan failed due to logistical shortcomings and deficient planning, not because of divine intervention. The vessels were inadequate for their designated mission. The chain of command between the two invasion forces was poorly integrated. The operation was launched during typhoon season, a well-known fact that seasoned naval commanders would have recognized as a serious operational hazard. The Mongols were attempting a form of warfare, large-scale, long-distance amphibious operations that lay entirely outside their core institutional expertise. They were steppe cavalry commanders trying to orchestrate a naval invasion, relying on recently subjugated populations to provide ships and much of the manpower, with all the inherent motivation issues that entailed. The storms did not cause the failure, they merely exposed a failure already embedded in the planning. The political repercussions within the empire were significant. Kublai had expended years of resources, effectively strip mining the Korean peninsula to near exhaustion to provision the invasion forces, compelled the newly conquered southern Chinese populace to construct fleets under brutal conditions, and ultimately had nothing to show for his efforts. Discontent began to simmer in Korea and southern China. Kublai's critics among the Mongols, who frequently saw him as overly Sinicized, overly settled, and too detached from nomadic traditions, now had potent arguments against him. The narrative of an unstoppable Mongol advance suddenly appeared considerably less absolute when confronted with the realities of the Japanese coast, Vietnamese jungles, and Javanese swamps. This particular chapter of Mongol history, often overlooked, represents a significant flaw in how we recount these events. The period spanning roughly the 1260s to the 1340s, known to historians as the Pax Mongolica or Mongol Peace, constitutes one of the most pivotal eras in global history, yet it typically receives only a passing mention. Consider the remarkable achievements of the Mongol Empire at its zenith, a unified political system, or at least a complex web of interconnected khanates stretching from the coasts of Korea to Poland and from Siberia to the Persian Gulf. The vast expanse of Eurasia was brought under a single administrative authority. For the first time ever, one could traverse overland from the Mediterranean Sea to the Pacific Ocean without encountering hostile borders, navigating a jumble of conflicting legal frameworks, or paying off numerous local potentates for safe passage. A contemporary Persian chronicler famously captured the essence of this epoch, stating that a young woman carrying a gold nugget on her head could journey safely throughout the entire realm. While this is an idealized image, and the empire was no perfect society, the underlying truth was a widely enforced stability across an enormous territory. This stability facilitated unprecedented levels of trade and movement. Key to this stability was the paisa, an imperial tablet crafted from gold, silver, or iron, depending on the bearer's status, which served as a universal passport and credit document. A gold paisa granted its holder the right to demand provisions, fresh horses, shelter, and assistance from any imperial official or subject anywhere within the empire, effectively carrying the authority of the Khan himself. Marco Polo, along with his father and uncle, were granted gold pieces by Kublai Khan when they were eventually permitted to depart the Yuan court in the early 1290s. These tablets enabled the three Venetian merchants to undertake a journey of approximately 15,000 miles from Beijing to the Persian Gulf, across the Indian Ocean, through Persia to the Black Sea, and finally home to Venice, and lived to recount their experiences. The YAM relay system allowed this vast world to operate with genuinely astounding speed for its time. An estimated 10,000 relay stations across the empire were maintained with roughly 200,000 to 300,000 horses specifically designated for official communications. An urgent imperial message could travel 200 miles in a single day. The 4,000-mile distance from Beijing to the western edge of Persia could be covered in less than a month. In an era where most information progressed at the pace of a walking horse or a sailing vessel, this was truly extraordinary. Military commanders could coordinate operations across entire continents. Merchants could obtain reliable pricing data from distant markets before dispatching their caravans. The Khan in Beijing possessed a more immediate understanding of events on the Caspian Sea than most medieval European kings had concerning affairs in the next valley over. The economic ramifications were transformative. The Silk Road, which had always been a network of routes rather than a single thoroughfare, and had existed in various iterations since the Han Dynasty, reached its greatest historical scope and volume of traffic under the Pax Mongolica. It wasn't solely silk and spices that traversed these routes, as commonly believed. Ideas, technologies, and people also moved. Chinese papermaking technology, which had been present in East Asia for over a millennium, spread westward during this period and ultimately reached Europe. Paper rapidly replaced the more expensive parchment and vellum as the preferred medium for European manuscripts within a single generation after the Pax Mongolica, dramatically lowering the cost of producing written materials. The profound implications of this change for literacy, scholarly pursuits, and eventually the printing revolution can scarcely be overstated. Knowledge of gunpowder, which the Chinese had been employing militarily since at least the 10th century, migrated westward in more refined forms than had previously crossed cultural barriers. Within a century, European armies were experimenting with firearms. While the progression from Mongol-era technological exchange to the military revolution of the 15th and 16th centuries is not a straightforward path, it is undoubtedly a tangible connection. Medical knowledge flowed in both directions. Advances by Islamic scholars in surgery, pharmacology, and anatomy made their way to China. Conversely, Chinese practices in acupuncture, herbal medicine, and pulse diagnosis traveled westward. Rashid al-Din, the Persian scholar who served as the Ilkhanate prime minister in the early 14th century, compiled a comprehensive collection of Chinese medical knowledge in Persian. Such a document would have been impossible to create had it not been for the Mongol infrastructure that fostered interaction between Chinese and Persian academics. Rashid al-Din himself warrants particular attention as he embodies something unprecedented in human intellectual evolution. He was a Jewish-born convert to Islam who served in the courts of Mongol rulers, themselves Buddhists and shamanists who were gradually embracing Islam. He authored historical accounts not only of the Islamic and Persian realms, but also of China, India, the Franks, the Jews, and the nomadic peoples of the steppes. This was a truly comprehensive history, representing the first serious attempt to chronicle the histories of all human civilizations as one interconnected narrative, rather than as distinct and isolated tales. The Mongol Empire established the conditions necessary for such an undertaking to be conceived. Prior to the Pax Mongolica, no individual could have amassed the range of sources he utilized. This interconnected world catalyzed novel ways of thinking. I'd like to pose a question here, one that likely lacks a straightforward answer, but is nonetheless worth contemplating. If the Mongols had not constructed this pervasive infrastructure, if they had merely conquered and ravaged without establishing the trade and communication networks that underpinned the Pax Mongolica, Would the European Renaissance have occurred at the same time it did? The Renaissance, among other things, involved the rediscovery and reincorporation of classical knowledge, much of it preserved and advanced by Islamic scholars within the very intellectual tradition epitomized by Baghdad. The pathways through which this knowledge permeated Europe during the 13th and 14th centuries largely traversed the Mongol world. I am not asserting that the Mongols were the sole cause of the Renaissance. History rarely operates with such simple causation. However, I am contending that the interconnected world they forged, at immense human cost, dramatically accelerated the exchange of knowledge between civilizations. The far-reaching consequences of this acceleration are genuinely difficult to separate from the larger narrative of how the modern world came into being. The profound irony, truly immense in its scale and impact, is that the very infrastructure that facilitated all these advancements would also contribute to the most devastating pandemic in recorded human history. Here, the story darkens in a manner that transcends the violence of battlefields. What I'm about to describe is a system collapsing under the weight of its own accomplishments. The Pax Mongolica inadvertently set the stage for the Black Death, and in turn, the Black Death played a significant role in dismantling the Pax Mongolica. The mechanism was self-reinforcing. Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for bubonic plague, had cycled within rodent populations in Central Asia for an extended period before it began to infect human hosts in catastrophic numbers. Marmots, ground squirrels, and other burrowing animals inhabiting the Mongolian and Central Asian steppes are natural reservoirs for the plague bacterium. They carry it without succumbing to the disease, having coexisted with it evolutionarily long enough to develop a partial resistance. Humans, however, lack this immunity. Current leading research, including a pivotal 2022 study published in Nature that analyzed ancient DNA from plague victims in Kyrgyzstan burial sites dating to 1338 to 1339, identifies the Tian Shan region of Central Asia as the probable origin point of the Black Death strain. This was territory adjacent to the Mongol Empire, situated along trade routes, precisely where one would anticipate an interaction between Central Asian rodent populations and high-traffic human commercial networks to lead to a spillover event. The historian William McNeill, in his seminal 1976 work Plagues and Peoples, posited that the expansion of Mongol military and commercial activities into previously isolated ecological zones created new points of contact between human communities and the plague reservoir. Soldiers establishing camps in steppe regions and hunters trapping marmots, whose pelts were prized trade commodities, brought the bacteria into close proximity with humans. The disease did not require the Mongols to exist, but the Mongol infrastructure provided it with superhighways for dissemination. By 1331, Chinese records documented a significant epidemic in the regions of northeastern China under the Yuan Dynasty. From there, the infection spread westward along the trade routes, reaching the territories of the Golden Horde in Central Asia and the northern Black Sea region by the early 1340s. Then, in 1346, at the Genoese trading colony of Kaffa on the Crimean coast, an event unfolded that would profoundly shape European history, arguably more so than almost any medieval military engagement. The Golden Horde, led by Khan Janabeg, was besieging Kaffa, a fortified trading post controlling access to the lucrative Black Sea commerce. The Mongol forces outside the walls were afflicted by plague spreading through their camp. Soldiers were dying in numbers that rendered the continuation of the siege unsustainable. Janabeg, according to the records of Gabriella Ducci, an Italian notary who compiled testimonies from survivors, commanded his troops to hurl plague-infected cadavers into the besieged city using catapults. This represented a deliberate act of biological warfare in the 14th century. The intention was for the disease to spread within the city, weakening the defenders and potentially forcing their surrender. The Genoese defenders reportedly rushed to dispose of the bodies in the sea. However, their efforts likely proved futile, as rats and fleas harboring the bacterium had probably infiltrated the city long before the first catapult shot. The conditions of the siege themselves would have fostered transmission pathways that no amount of corpse disposal could counteract. Nevertheless, the image remains historically etched. An empire that had revolutionized the world through its interconnected trade routes was now weaponizing the very repercussions of that connectivity. When Kaffa's Genoese populace eventually evacuated by sea, they carried the plague westward. Their vessels made port in Constantinople, Messina in Sicily, Genoa, and Venice. By early 1348, the Black Death had spread across the Italian peninsula. By late 1348, it had reached France, Spain, and England. By 1350, Scandinavia was affected, and by 1353, Russia. The death toll remains a highly debated topic in demographic history. For Europe, historians generally agree that the Black Death claimed between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire population from approximately 1347 to 1353. Certain regions suffered even greater losses, with parts of Italy, France, and England possibly losing 60% of their inhabitants. Europe's total death count was estimated at 25 to 50 million people over roughly 6 years. The global toll, encompassing Asia and the Middle East, where the plague also had a devastating impact, might have been 75 to 100 million. To contextualize this, the world's population in 1340 was around 450 million. The Black Death may have eradicated between 15% and 22% of all living individuals on Earth. The Mongol Empire was not spared. The Yuan Dynasty in China experienced catastrophic population declines throughout the 14th century. Estimates suggest a 30% to 40% reduction in China's population between the late Song period's peak and the mid-14th century. This decline was driven by both the violence of the conquest era and the subsequent plague. The Golden Horde's population collapsed, tax revenues plummeted, and military recruitment became challenging as the pool of eligible individuals dwindled. Agricultural systems, reliant on extensive organized labor, began to disintegrate. I want to articulate a crucial structural point clearly, as it is often misunderstood in most narratives. The Black Death did not directly cause the Mongol Empire's collapse. The empire was already experiencing fragmentation before the plague's arrival. We will soon discuss the civil wars and succession crises. What the plague accomplished was to accelerate and intensify every existing vulnerability simultaneously. It was not a primary cause, but an accelerant, a catastrophic magnifier of pre-existing instabilities. Imagine the empire as a structure exhibiting numerous cracks in its walls. The Black Death was a seismic event that impacted these already fractured walls. The cracks existed prior to the earthquake, but without the earthquake, some of those walls might have endured for another generation or two. And then there is the ultimate irony, the Silk Road. The pinnacle achievement of the Pax Mongolica, the system that had linked East and West and facilitated the most significant surge in commerce and cultural exchange in the pre-modern world, became the conduit. The disease traveled the very routes used for silk, spices, and ideas. The connectivity, which had been the empire's greatest contribution to the world, transformed into the mechanism of the world's most severe demographic catastrophe. History rarely offers lessons so unambiguous. When you establish a network that connects everything, you inevitably connect everything, including those elements you would prefer to keep isolated. Let me transport you back to 1259. Möngke Khan, the fourth great Khan, a grandson of Genghis and a capable, respected ruler who had managed the empire's internal tensions with considerable skill, dies during his campaign against the Song dynasty. He perishes in the field, likely from dysentery, at the age of 51. He leaves behind no clearly designated successor. What unfolds next marks the beginning of the end. Two of Möngke's brothers simultaneously declare themselves Great Khan. Kublai, commanding the Mongol forces in China, and Ariq Böke, holding the Mongolian heartland, both convene Kurultai, the grand assemblies meant to confer legitimacy. And both are proclaimed Khan by their respective supporters. A civil war erupted in 1260, lasting 4 years. It resulted in the significant, though unquantifiable, loss of life and consumed resources and political capital that the empire never fully recovered. Kublai ultimately emerged victorious. His triumph stemmed primarily from his command over the more affluent, densely populated, and economically productive territories within China, coupled with his considerably more sophisticated political acumen compared to his sibling. Ariq Böke surrendered in 1264, succumbing to death in captivity 2 years subsequent. While the official cause remained unrecorded, the persistent and plausible murmurs of poison circulated. Yet, victory in the civil war failed to reinstate unity. It merely cemented Kublai's supremacy within a system that had already surpassed the point of genuine integration. A cousin named Kaidu, a descendant of Ögedei, Genghis's son and the second great Khan, refused to acknowledge Kublai's authority, spending over 3 decades battling him from a Central Asian stronghold. Kaidu was never decisively defeated during Kublai's lifetime. The rebellion was finally quelled in 1301, 7 years after Kublai's demise. For the final third of Kublai's reign, the Great Khan continually engaged in warfare against his own kin on his western frontier, concurrently striving to finalize the conquest of China and initiate invasions of Japan and Southeast Asia on his eastern and southern flanks. The overextension was not merely symbolic, it was tangible and quantifiable in lives and wealth. In the interim, the 4 principal khanates that had emerged from the empire, the Yuan Dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde in the western steppe and Russia, were evolving along such disparate paths that the notion of a cohesive Mongol world grew increasingly fictitious. The Ilkhanate presented the most striking example. Hulagu's successors governed Persia and Iraq. Within 50 years of the Baghdad conquest, Ilkhan Ghazan converted to Islam in 1295, a formal, public conversion accompanied by a political commitment that heralded a genuine reorientation of the state's identity, rather than a mere personal spiritual shift. The Ilkhanate effectively transformed into a Persian Islamic state headed by a Mongol ruling dynasty. Persian became the lingua franca of administration and culture. Islamic law expanded its jurisdiction. The Mongol rulers were steadily becoming Persian rulers, who coincidentally possessed Genghis's lineage. In the Yuan Dynasty, a parallel phenomenon unfolded in the opposite cultural direction. Kublai governed through Chinese administrative structures. His court ceremonies adhered to Chinese imperial protocols. Chinese became the functional language of government. Kublai established his capital in the Chinese style, patronized Chinese art and scholarship, and oversaw his Chinese subjects through the Confucian bureaucratic tradition honed over centuries by the Chinese imperial system. To a significant portion of the Mongolian nobility, he was barely Mongol any longer. The Golden Horde in the western steppe was assimilated into a Turkic-speaking cultural milieu that harbored traditions vastly different from either the Chinese or Persian worlds. The Mongols of the Golden Horde intermarried with Kipchak Turks, adopted Kipchak language and customs, and eventually embraced Islam, though an Islam shaped by the nomadic steppe tradition, quite distinct from the urban Persian Islam of the Ilkhanate. 4 khanates, 4 distinct administrative languages, 4 divergent religious trajectories, 4 varied economic orientations, China's agricultural bounty, Persia's urban trade, the steppe's pastoral economy, and Russia's forest resources, and crucially, 4 different definitions of political legitimacy. Each khanate had developed its own localized basis for governance that was increasingly detached from the original Mongol framework. The outcome was not merely rivalry, it was conflict. The Ilkhanate and the Golden Horde engaged in a series of sanguinary wars from the 1260s through the early 14th century over territories in Azerbaijan and the Caucasus. 2 khanates, both governed by Genghis Khan's descendants, both having converted to Islam within decades of one another, were at war over land. The shared ancestry, intended to unify the empire, proved insufficient to overcome the divergent interests engendered by ruling different territories. Here lies the profound structural dilemma, plainly stated. The Mongol Empire was too vast and too diverse to sustain a unified identity across generations. The momentous conquests had incorporated dozens of distinct civilizations: Persian, Chinese, Russian, Turkic, Armenian, Korean, Tibetan, Arab, and Indian. The Mongols constituted a small numerical minority governing all these peoples. To govern effectively, they were compelled to engage with local administrative traditions. To preserve legitimacy, they had to speak local languages and adopt local symbols of authority. And when one engages profoundly enough with another culture over an extended period, one does not alter it as much as it alters oneself. The Mongol rulers of the Ilkhanate, in the most critical practical sense, became Persian. The Mongol rulers of the Yuan, in the most critical practical sense, became Chinese. The empire's disintegration didn't primarily stem from external military defeats, though those did eventually occur. Instead, it was a result of internal cultural assimilation. Over generations, the very civilizations the conquerors believed they had subjugated gradually absorbed them. Genghis Khan established an empire predicated on personal allegiance to him and his lineage. This principle proved sustainable for a first generation, perhaps even a second. However, personal loyalty cannot indefinitely endure across vast distances and decades of divergent development. By Kublai's death in 1294, no living individual had personally pledged an oath to Genghis Khan. The foundational loyalty structure had vanished. What lingered were competing assertions of blood ties to a man deceased for 67 years, leveraged to serve political agendas utterly disconnected from his initial vision. By the 1350s, the Yuan Dynasty faced the sort of turmoil that precedes collapse. This wasn't the sudden dramatic upheaval of military defeat, but rather the slow, relentless erosion of a system that had forfeited the trust of its populace. Catastrophic agricultural disruptions resulted from Yellow River floods in the late 1340s, displacing millions of peasants. The ensuing famine ravaged some of the world's most densely populated farming regions. The government's response proved inadequate, partly due to the plague simultaneously decimating the bureaucratic workforce, partly because the court was consumed by internal factionalism, and partly because Mongol rulers, governing through Chinese administrative systems, inherently relied on the cooperation of Chinese officials who had little personal incentive to labor tirelessly for a dynasty many considered a foreign occupation. Out of these famines, floods, and the plague emerged the Red Turban Rebellion, a millenarian movement drawing from Buddhist and Manichaean beliefs, promising an era of justice and the reinstatement of Chinese rule. From this rebellion arose Zhu Yuanzhang, a peasant from Anhui province whose parents had perished in the 1344 famine when he was 16. Having begged for food as a child and served as a Buddhist monk, he joined the rebel movement as a young adult with nothing to lose, exhibiting extraordinary natural aptitudes for military and political leadership. Zhu's forces seized the capital Dadu in September 1368. Tun Tima, the final Yuan emperor, retreated north into the Mongolian steppes with his remaining court and troops, dying 2 years later. His successors would govern a diminished Mongol state in the north, at times called the Northern Yuan, for another generation, yet they never returned to China in strength. The Mongol century in China had concluded. Zhu Yuanzhang declared himself the Hongwu Emperor, inaugurating the Ming Dynasty. The term Ming signifies brilliance or radiance. His founded dynasty would govern China for nearly 3 centuries. The Ming's reaction to their Mongol experience largely constituted a systematic reversal of everything the Pax Mongolica had embodied. The early Ming emperors viewed the Mongol era as a traumatic foreign occupation that needed to be terminated and rejected. They implemented a policy of commercial restriction, partially closing the maritime trade routes that the Mongols had established. They rebuilt and expanded the Great Wall, not primarily as a practical military barrier, which it never truly was, but as a declaration of imperial ideology. China would be China, defined by its boundaries, not interconnected with the world beyond them. The renowned voyages of Admiral Zheng He's treasure fleet, 7 remarkable expeditions between 1405 and 1433, reaching as far as East Africa and showcasing Chinese maritime prowess that eclipsed anything Europe would produce for another generation, were ultimately halted by imperial decree. The vessels were dismantled and records partially destroyed. China opted for isolation. The passage the Mongols had forcibly opened was intentionally sealed. Meanwhile, in Central Asia, Timur began to rise. Known in the West as Tamerlane, he was a Turco-Mongol ruler from the Samarkand region who asserted partial Genghis ancestry through his wife. Unable to claim the title of Khan by blood, he ruled through a puppet Khan while wielding actual power himself. Nevertheless, he leveraged the prestige of the Mongol legacy to legitimize conquest campaigns that rivaled Genghis Khans in their geographical scope and exceeded them in their specific, deliberate brutality. Timur sacked Delhi in 1398, executing, by his own accounts, 100,000 Hindu prisoners in a single day. He invaded the Ottoman Empire, defeating and capturing Sultan Bayezid I at the Battle of Ankara in 1402, an event that destabilized Ottoman expansion and possibly delayed Constantinople's fall by half a century. He consistently assaulted the Golden Horde, laying waste to its urban centers and massacring its inhabitants, thereby irrevocably dismantling its capacity to function as an organized polity. Then, in 1405, at roughly 68 years old, he passed away at Otrar in present-day Kazakhstan, while laying groundwork for an invasion of China. This undertaking would have been the most audacious military endeavor ever, targeting the very Ming dynasty responsible for driving out the Mongols 37 years prior. He had been campaigning eastward for several months. His demise due to illness occurred before he could cross the Chinese frontier. His vast dominion fractured within a single generation. The Golden Horde ultimately dissolved by the close of the 15th century. Ivan III of Moscow formally renounced his tributary obligations to the Mongols in 1480, an action historians recognize as the climax of the Tatar yoke over Russia, marking the end of a 2.5-century era of Mongol dominance that profoundly shaped Russian political culture, with its impacts still debated and felt today. There was no specific instance that marked the end of the Mongol Empire. No formal ceremony, no signed treaty, no decisive battle universally acknowledged as conclusive. The empire gradually diminished, transforming into disparate entities. It integrated into its surroundings, a process that had been unfolding for a century before the final Khanate officially stopped claiming its former title. So, what can we infer from all of this? The Mongol Empire, at its pinnacle, caused the deaths of an estimated 30 to 40 million individuals, based on contemporary assessments adjusted for known pre-modern population levels. In certain areas, the population losses were staggering, even by those standards. Northern China and the Iranian Plateau may have taken 150 years to recover to their pre-Mongol population figures. In sheer numbers, accounting for global population, the Mongol conquests might represent the deadliest instance of organized violence in human history preceding the 20th century. Yet, the world that emerged from the Mongol century was not merely a ruined version of what existed before. It was a reconfigured, different world. Some of this transformation was purely destructive. The agricultural heartland of Mesopotamia never fully recovered, and Baghdad's intellectual traditions were so severely broken that it forever altered the trajectory of Islamic civilization. These are undeniable, enduring losses that no amount of nuanced historical interpretation can gloss over. However, the Mongol era also instigated changes that were not exclusively destructive. The modern map of Eurasia still bears the indelible marks of the 13th century. Russia, as a unified state, the Russia that expanded across Siberia, became a major power and remains the largest nation on Earth, is significantly a result of the political restructuring that followed the Mongol conquest and the subsequent strengthening of Muscovite authority in the void left by the Mongols. The Ottoman Empire, which commanded the Middle East and Eastern Europe from the 14th century through World War I, ascended to power by filling the vacuum the Mongols created through their destruction of the Abbasid Caliphate and the disruption of Anatolia's existing state infrastructure. The Mongol legal code, the Yasa, with its emphasis on religious tolerance and merit-based governance, introduced concepts that were truly uncommon in the medieval world. One did not need to be Muslim to hold office in the Ilkhanate, nor Confucian to serve in the Yuan bureaucracy. The Mongols were indifferent to one's theological beliefs, provided taxes were paid and territory was competently administered. This stemmed more from pragmatism than principle, but it practically led to societies that were remarkably pluralistic by medieval standards. There is also the genetic legacy, seldom discussed in formal historical contexts, yet demonstrably real and measurable. Genetic research published in the early 2000s identified a specific Y chromosome lineage, present today in approximately 0.5% of the global male population, around 16 million men, which with high probability traces back to Genghis Khan or his close male relatives, representing the most successful genetic proliferation in recorded human history. Regardless of his other characteristics, Genghis Khan undeniably left a mark on the human species that physically exists within millions of individuals alive today. The most profound legacy, however, is also the most challenging to quantify. The Mongol Empire painfully demonstrated, through unprecedented levels of violence, that Eurasia could function as a single, interconnected system. This revealed that knowledge, technologies, goods, and ideas could flow across the entire expanse of the Old World, and that the separation of civilizations was a political condition, not an inevitable geographical fact. Once this reality was demonstrated, it could not be unseen. When the Pax Mongolica concluded and previous isolation returned, European merchants and explorers did not forget what had been possible. They began seeking new avenues to re-establish these connections through new routes, novel technologies, and fresh political and commercial frameworks. The Portuguese navigated around Africa, while Columbus sailed westward. However, these exploratory expeditions weren't solely fueled by inquisitiveness. A significant impetus came from the aspiration to re-establish connections with the Asian trade networks that had been severed following the Mongol Empire's decline. The Mongol Empire serves as the pivotal point where the pre-modern era transitioned into the modern one. While not the sole catalyst, nor a straightforward or uncomplicated cause, its influence was undeniably profound and far-reaching. This empire, despite leaving behind no lasting language, no enduring religious faith, and no dynasty that retained its original form, nevertheless reshaped the global landscape more dramatically than many empires that left all three. The largest contiguous empire ever known vanished so completely that most individuals today struggle to name any of Genghis Khan's successors beyond Kublai. Yet we inhabit a world significantly shaped by the Mongols. Let me reiterate the complete historical trajectory. An impoverished outcast from the Mongolian steppes forged the most expansive contiguous empire in human history. This feat was achieved through military brilliance, an unwavering commitment to systematic and absolute brutality, and an institutional inventiveness that revolutionized the application of organized aggression. His descendants extended this empire to the very gates of Vienna and the distant shores of Japan. They razed Baghdad's libraries to the ground and erected Persian observatories. They established the groundwork for intercontinental commerce and unwittingly facilitated the spread of the most devastating pandemic known to recorded history. They conquered the world, only to be gradually absorbed by the civilizations they initially sought to obliterate, generation after generation, until the empire fragmented. Was this empire a force primarily of devastation or one of integration? I've contemplated this dilemma for years, consistently arriving at the same conclusion: it embodied both, inextricably and concurrently. The destruction and the integration were not distinct phases of its narrative. They were two facets of the same story, viewed from different perspectives, experienced depending on whether one was amidst the burning library or traversing the trade routes that its destruction inadvertently opened. This inherent duality is precisely what renders its history inexhaustible. It defies reduction to a simplistic judgment. The more closely one examines it, the greater its complexity becomes. And I believe that this very intricacy is the crucial takeaway, because that is the true nature of history itself. Not a mere lesson, nor a definitive verdict, but a chronicle of humanity's full spectrum of capabilities, all unfolding simultaneously. If this presentation offered you new insights, a novel perspective, an unfamiliar detail, or a lingering question, please click the like button. Your support significantly impacts the channel's visibility to those who would appreciate its content. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is what we consistently provide: the comprehensive narrative from beginning to end. I'll connect with you in the subsequent installment.